hang on a moment, I'll just press the right button for that. Hello, Sally, I can see you now. You wonder why or what happened that made her actually come as a lady's companion. Don't think there was anything bad went on, but I'm not sure. Anyway, she was fairly well educated for her time. And one evening, Dad was doing his reading and he came across the word picturesque. Well, Grandma very quickly said, no, George, the word is picturesque. Now, that suggests that I was actually probably had a lot of education in my upbringing. Dad's family went to school on horseback across country and there were 3 kids on the horse. When he was about 14, so it tells you he was actually an older father, we had the Spanish flu epidemic. And despite several months of no schooling, Dad matriculated. Now, when I hear them talking about kids doing their studies online and getting all these extra NCEA credits and so on, I think, that's exactly what happened in the Spanish flu, isn't it? And yet we get the idea that for the kids today, this is actually something special and new. You know, Dad didn't have online studies. I don't know where he did his learning. I shouldn't imagine they had textbooks at home. Anyway, to Dad's disappointment, he was unable to go on to secondary school. Being the oldest of 7 and having a father in a poorly paid job, they just didn't have the money to send him. And that rubbed off on me. You know, I was only a girl. I mean, all you ladies know that attitude. But I was still expected to do my best academically because Dad was very proud that I was the first, and I think the only one of my generation to actually get a university degree. Mum was the youngest of 14. So, you know, 21 people in their families. So I've got lots of cousins. In fact, some of my cousins are quite a bit older than I am, and they're all dying off. I think we've had 3 in the last year. Mum grew up in a village near Reading in Berkshire. I won't go into the details of that. And Dad was in the New Zealand Army. He actually falsified his age because he was too old to serve, but he managed to get in. And he was a dispatch rider and had a motorbike accident. And he was in a convalescent home. And he met Mum there and they married. After a while, I was born. And when I was 6 months old, Dad was sent back to New Zealand, repatriated back because he was no longer fit for active service. And to be honest, he was quite disillusioned with what he found back here. He said in some of his letters about the Kiwis never stopped moaning about the things that they didn't have. And I think, sounds about right again. You know, quite a lot of our Kiwis now are moaning because we're locked down or we can't get this or we can't get that. But that's what it was like in 1944, 45, yeah. In the meantime, Mum had to find passage to follow Dad back to New Zealand. There was a ban on wives going overseas to live permanently until August 44. New Zealand government wasn't really interested in war brides and their children, so they did little to assist in getting us passage to New Zealand. From what I can gather through reading Mum's letters to Dad, she kept writing to New Zealand House, and also they had a friend in high places, and they tried to hurry things along. Initially, the reply was April 45 at the earliest. So that was mid-44, so that was going to be a year. Anyway, suddenly she received notification that we were leaving in 3 weeks. That was mid-December 44. What a hectic time that must have been. All the stuff to organise, British passport presumably. They had to pack up a lifetime of her belongings, for her and me, and I was nearly one, into a trunk and a suitcase. That was all she was allowed to bring.
Oh.
She had to say goodbye to her friends and Rillies, and I don't know who paid for our fare. We came in a convoy, actually, one of the few ships that did, because we had on board the Duke of Gloucester, and he was coming out to be the Governor General of Australia at that stage. We got to Sydney, and there was a 3-week dockwork strike. So we sat in Sydney for 3 weeks. So I think I went to all sorts of places like the Blue Mountains and Taronga Park. But of course, Mum had no money for shopping. That was another issue. Dad had to somehow get her money. But anyway, all that sounds like the muddle of MIQ. Well, to me it does. Actually, when we arrived in Wellington, I don't know why we went into Wellington and not Auckland, we met another strike. The railway workers were striking. They wanted a pay rise. We did get up here, and Dad actually met us in Wellington. But anyway, then there was rationing. We had rationing here, and my husband told me that rationing finished in England in 1953. And containers are held up here in the ports, and there's a shortage of pet food in the supermarkets. But in the UK, rationing continued well on, as I said. And when I was about 5, maybe slightly younger, and my mother disputed this, she said, "You can't possibly remember that." I can remember her baking Christmas cakes, and Dad actually soldered them into tins. Then they wrapped them up in hessian and sewed them in. Then they put a customs declaration on, and then they were posted to England so that they had Christmas cakes in England. When I gave her the details, she knew I had remembered it. Anyway, Dad had found himself a job with the Ministry of Works as a surveyor in a little place called Mangataroto. And Nedal, if you had got to Dargaville by the main road, you would have gone through Mangataroto.
Maybe.
And, yes, you would have. On the main road, you would. Yep.
Yeah.
And he was responsible for opening up what we now know as Te Arai or Arai Point out of Mangawhai. And he was actually basically responsible for the roads from Te Hana north up to the top of the Brindewins. Hello, Aisha.
Hello.
And also basically over to Dargaville. We lived in a house, well, we called it a house. It was actually 2 army huts pushed end on end. And we were talking yesterday about outside toilets. We had an outside toilet too, and Dad had to empty it every week. I can still remember when we got a fridge, and all the local village women thought that my mother was spoilt because my dad had saved up enough money to buy Mum a fridge. I was about 4, I think. Our local school was Mangataroto District High School. It's now the primary school. The secondary school is down a side road, and it's Otamatea High. I walked there, and we walked along the main road. So you had the big trucks and all the rest of it. You didn't drive to school, even if it was pouring with rain. First of all, Mum couldn't drive. When I turned 13, we moved to Dargaville, and Dad's territory shifted, and he then became responsible for the roads right up to the Waipua Forest. And we had a brand new house, and it had a flushing toilet. It was a huge change for me, actually, because in Form 3, we had 4 classes of kids. So that means there were probably about 120 kids. And I progressed through the years and got to what we called in those days Form 7. We had 5 students in our class that year, and that was the most the school had ever seen. Most of our subjects were taught alongside the Form 6 kids. I was the only one doing biology in Form 7, and instead of learning chemistry in Form 7, I learned how to play 500. Oh, I know. We went to school 2 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings, because we didn't have a maths teacher. The previous year, the maths teacher had left to become the principal of a new school in Auckland. And it was the local power board engineer. He had a couple of maths papers in his degree, so they roped him in to teach us. You know, I wonder how kids would get on today if they had to go to school on Saturday mornings or 2 nights a week. Yeah. Anyway, it came time to decide on a career. And I had worked in a chemist shop during the school holidays. I didn't like the serving the customers very much, was never my thing. But I really enjoyed being out the back, you know, counting out the pills and doing all those things. So I thought I'd like to be a pharmacist. So we investigated that, but you had to go to Wellington to do that. And my mum was a helicopter mother. You know, I look back on it, I know the term wasn't invented in those days, but that's what she did. You know, if I went up a slide, careful, careful, don't hurt yourself. So, you know, I've been a bit scared of a lot of those things for quite some time. So I thought, oh, well, secondary teaching, specialising in science. So off to Auckland University and a science degree. My first teaching job was at Rutherford High School, which you'll have heard of because that's where Simon Bridges went to school. And I started out teaching a mixture of science and maths. I soon discovered I didn't actually like teaching science very much. But I really, well, yes, I think I do know why. Part of it is maths is easy to see it's right and wrong, which I think is probably why a lot of people don't like it. But also it's how your boss, for want of a better word, keeps an eye on you. And my head of science thought that I wasn't doing a very good job. Rather than helping me overcome what he saw as my difficulties, he just criticised, picked on, picked on them and picked on me. So that was really when I started disliking teaching science. And yet I loved science and I still do. After 3 years at Rutherford, I moved to Thames High School, where I taught maths only. Now, amongst my pupils there was one Lee Hopper. Now, you may have heard of Lee. He's the son of Hopper Developments, who owns several large retirement villages. Maygrove in Orewa is one of theirs. There's one in Kumeu, Marsden Cove, and a couple of others. But the reason I mention Lee has got nothing to do with his supposed wealth. It's the fact that his father owned a farm on the other side of the Coromandel Peninsula, and that farm became Pauanui. They lived on the farm and they didn't have access to secondary schooling over there. So Mr. Hopper Senior invented a hoppercraft. It's a bit like a hovercraft, but it was one that Lee and his 2 younger sisters were able to go across the Tairua estuary, either at high tide or low tide, to Tairua, where they caught the school bus to come across the Coromandel Peninsula over the Kopu Hikawai Road to Thames High School. I figured out that it was probably an hour and a half travel at least each way. The road was gravel. It was opened in 1967 and wasn't sealed until 1973. So I think, you know, they had a lot to contend with. And of course, no mummy to drop them at the school gate. She would have had to have gone across in the hoppercraft as well. A few years after I had taught Lee, my then husband and I went across to Pauanui just for a day trip, and we were having a look at the golf course, which is next to the airport. And Lee popped his head out and he said, "Oh, I'm just going for a flight. Would you like to come?" So we hopped in his little plane, went up over the pinnacles. Those of you who know your way around, tramping in particular, will know the pinnacles up the top of the Kauronga Valley. And the views of the whole of the Coromandel Peninsula of that area are just absolutely spectacular. Well, I married while I was down there, my late husband, and he was also a maths teacher. And I had 6 years off teaching to raise our two little ones. And I've heard several, can't see any of them there, several of our virtual village members speaking about their spouses having dementia. Now, Merv died several years ago. At the time, he suffered from dementia. So, I can feel for what you people are saying. Now, people told me I was going to be bored silly at home with little ones. So I undertook further study. I did things like computer programming and statistics and economics and accounting. They were all useful when I needed to go back teaching. And at the same time, I became heavily involved in the Play Centre movement. Oh, going back to computer programming. You didn't do what they do today. Some of you may have met the old punch card system. And we used to have to write the program, punch the cards, they were about that big, and take them to the bank, and they were sent down to Wanganui, to the computer centre down there. And if you got one little thing in the wrong place, then your whole program didn't work, and you had to go and get it, find out what the problem was and send it back the next day. I'd much rather do programming today. Anyway, then I went back teaching for a couple of years. Then it was time for another break. In 81, we took our two kids, then aged about 8 and 7 or something, out of school for a year and travelled overseas. And we spent time in the USA, UK, and Europe. We took a suitcase full of correspondence maths lessons, and that was the only stuff that we took with them for school. They reluctantly did those, and they had to write a journal each. That was the sum total of their formal schooling for the year we were out. Some people thought we were mad. Others thought it was a really good idea. And both of the children still recall their trips, each of them as a keen traveller. In fact, my daughter took her younger son on a similar trip in his last year at primary school, and it also kindled my love of travel. Anyway, back to teaching again. And I discovered that teaching slower children was actually a lot easier than it had been prior to having had children. So I'm wondering if maybe we should make having children a prerequisite for teaching. Yeah, one year at Hauraki Plains College, I shared some very slow fourth formers with the teacher of remedial English, or remedial reading actually. The boys wanted to get their driver's license, and they were all just coming up 15. So they had to learn to read. Great motivator, that. And I chipped in with whatever maths I could that related to their driver's licenses. I can still recall one young girl that I taught in that class, and she had not a clue. So one day I took her shopping. And I said, we're buying sausages. Now, there's 4 people in my family, and we're going to have 2 sausages each. How many sausages do we need to buy? Boy, she was going on 15, and she struggled with that. Then I gave her my purse and said, right, the butcher's told you it's this much. Find enough money to pay the butcher. Well, she got some money out, so then I made her check the change. That was probably one of her best maths lessons, going shopping with the teacher. But I'm wondering as well if that mightn't be what could be needed in our prisons. You know, we talked a couple of weeks ago about prisoners needing maths and reading. Anyway, my daughter was informed too. She was at Thames High School. I was back teaching at Thames High School. And she was really keen to study technical drawing. She'd been building Lego houses since she was 4. And just in case you haven't figured out at this stage, she is now an architect. Anyway,
wow.
she couldn't do tech drawing because only the boys were allowed to do tech drawing. They did tech drawing, metalwork and woodwork. Can you remember that? No, Nidal won't, but some of you Kiwis will. Anyway, we discussed it and I suggested to my husband that we return to Auckland, where maybe they weren't quite so sexist. And he said, well, if you can get a job, we'll go. So I applied for 2 jobs and I got both of them. So that was that. So we moved. And I spent a couple of years at one of those schools. Then I moved to Papatauri High and I spent probably 20 years there. And when I started there, it was predominantly white middle class. Those of you who are familiar with the decile system, we were a decile 7 school. Now, if you go there today, you'd be lucky to find a handful of white kids, and it's about decile 2 or 3, I think. You may be familiar with the principal there. You've seen him on TV quite a bit because Papatauri High was the centre of one of those clusters late last year, I think.
Yeah.
Vaughan Quio. Now, when I first started at Papatauri, Vaughan was actually head boy, and it was his ambition to go back and become the principal of Papatauri High. He's got there. Okay, what about teaching itself? Well, teaching's changed a lot since I began, and Bruce will know that. I doubt there are many streamed classes today. I've got a cynical view of that. It might damage the poor little thing's well-being. And yet, don't we stream our rugby team? Don't we stream our Olympic contenders? You don't go to the Olympics if you're not good enough. You don't get in the All Blacks if you're not good enough. So maybe we should be looking at that, but perhaps I better not say any more on that one. When I first started teaching, non-contact periods were there so that the timetable would work. They weren't there for the school to be nice to you at all. So the number of non-contacts you got was fairly arbitrary. And the younger you were in your teaching career, the fewer you got. Teachers Union actually negotiated a minimum number, and that number has crept up over the years. In fact, I think that beginning teachers now get the equivalent of a day off a week. They're supposed to do preparation and go and observe the more experienced teachers and a whole heap of other things, do some marking. But I've heard heads of department complaining in the more recent years that the beginning teachers expect them to prepare the lessons and prepare their assessment tasks. I don't know. Anyway, having said that, I wouldn't like to return to teaching, not in a secondary school. The demands are enormous. First of all, you've got to know your subject matter, and I'm afraid we've got some who don't know that either, and that sounds cynical too, but it's not, it's true. You seem to have to be a parent, you've got to be a counsellor, and everything else. And if you get time, you do some teaching. That's the impression that I'm getting. Recently, we've heard a lot about declining maths standards in the past 2 decades. There's a Professor Gavin Martin of the Royal Society. He had a lot to say last week about that. I think we older folk could probably help him with his solutions. My first reaction would be put maths specialists in all schools, including preschools. Unfortunately, I don't think you'd be able to get the maths specialists because they wouldn't pay them enough. There's too much competition out in the private sector. And yet I know I've had, as a head of department, to put in gazetters who had 6th form maths and get them to teach 3rd form. Part of the problem as well is that we've got primary school teachers who are more into drawing pretty posters and things, and they don't like maths. So how can they actually teach maths? I've got to say I'd far rather go travelling, play golf, play bridge, or even go cycling. We've done quite a few cycle tours. Now I'll just share some memories of my teaching career. When I'd been at Papatoetoe for a couple of years, I said to the head of department, could I teach 7th form calculus? I'm getting a bit bored teaching to 6th formers only. And he said, no, I'm sorry, we've got enough calculus teachers, but you could teach stats if you like. Well, I had done some stats in my degree. So I said, oh, okay. So I did. I taught it for, I don't know, 15 years, I suppose.
Wow.
I marked scholarship for many years and got a bit bored teaching stats. So towards the end of my career, when I was the head of department, I decided I'd teach calculus instead of stats. Anyway, the very first class I took had 3 exceedingly bright boys in it and quite a number of mediocre students. Anyway, one day, not long into my calculus career, these 3 bright boys came to me somewhat embarrassed at the end of the lesson, and they said, Miss, you taught something wrong today. And I said, oh, did I? Okay, take me through it. So we then came to an arrangement that they would teach themselves while listening to what I was teaching the rest of the class, and would then help me if I got stuck. It worked well. The 3rd form class, again at Papatoetoe, in fact, I think all my recollections of Papatoetoe came in, and on their first day, they announced proudly to me, we hate maths. I said, do you? Oh, we'll just have to change that, won't we? After a while, I discovered that what had happened was that their intermediate teacher the previous year was actually hated maths himself, taught it badly, and passed his attitude on to them. Not sure if it was that same class, but I had a girl who seemed to be missing almost every maths period. And I discovered that she was going to the sick bay. Now, am I making her that sick? So I said to the kids in the class, what's going on with her? And they said, oh, don't worry about it, miss. She's been volunteering to do things for the teacher in maths class ever since she started school. So it's nothing to do with you. Recently, my husband, I have remarried, and I went out for a drink. And I looked at the waiter and I thought, hang on, I know him. I looked at his name badge. I said to him, hi, I know you. And he looked me up and down and he said, oh, yes, miss, I know you. You taught me maths in 4th form. Okay. Right, well, the sad part of the story is that we were still streaming our classes, and this was the 2nd stream of at least a dozen, possibly 15, I can't remember exactly, but certainly 2nd stream. So they were pretty bright kids, but they must be the laziest class I ever taught, totally unmotivated. And I thought, it was soon into the NCEA, so I thought, righto, let's do some NCEA papers in 4th form. That'll mean you don't have to work quite so hard next year. Why would we want to do that? They said. No, don't be stupid. So that was that. And I can remember saying to this boy, to his father at parent interviews, you know, your son has got so much potential, but he's actually really lazy. Oh, yes, said the father. Oh, I looked at the father and I thought, now I know why the son's so lazy. You could see it in their whole attitude. But this boy could have gone on. He could have had a professional career. That was his choice. And it's not up to me to judge him, but really, I am sorry that he is basically only a waiter. But he still greets me really cheerfully whenever I see him. In that same class, there was a Maori boy. We didn't have lots of Maori kids in those days, but his was a really sad story. Remember, I said this was the 2nd stream. The previous year, I had taught him in the bottom stream. And I was saying to his other teachers, and I can't remember the boy's name, this lad is so quick. I said, he's wasting his time in this class. And they said, yes, he is. So we did a bit of investigation. His parents were moving house all the time. Every few weeks, they'd move to keep ahead of the police. Anyway, they decided to put him into my class the following year. And he came to me on the first day. He said, what am I doing in this class, miss? And I said, what's the problem? He said, I'm too dumb to be in here. I said, no, you are not. I said, and you're in here because I know what you have learned and what you haven't learned. And so I'll be able to help you with what you haven't learned. Anyway, somehow we muddled our way through that year. And I think it was the following year I retired. A couple of years later, I went back over to the school to deliver something. And there in the reception area was this beautifully dressed young Maori man in his school uniform. And I said, hi, are you still at school? Oh, yes, he said, I'm here to play in the first 15. Well, at least he stayed right through to 7th form. Okay, he didn't get too much in the way of qualifications. He probably got level 1 NCEA. But given the start that he had in life, that was pretty good. Now, one final memory, and this one really is the one that sticks with me. At Papatoetoe, not only did we have streamed classes, but we had, and some of you may be aware of it, a branch of Kilston School for the Deaf. And so we had a lot of deaf kids. We also had a unit for physically disabled. Well, they called it physically disabled, but most of them were also somewhat slow. And the kids in these 2 units all came very well supported with teacher aides. But the kids who were not overly bright didn't get much in the way of teacher aid support, which was a bit of a shame. Anyway, we knew that this particular year, our intake contained several very slow students. So we got our heads together and we went to the principal and we said, could we possibly put all the kids from the deaf unit, the disabled unit, and these slow ones in one small class? Or when I say small, probably about 20. Oh, yes, okay, let's do that. So we carefully picked our teachers. We were interested in doing something for these kids and we wanted them to succeed. Anyway, we got them in there and I can remember one little boy, he was so slow getting to class. He didn't like maths. He knew he was a failure and he'd been told so many times he was dumb and a failure and all those other things. Anyway, I put together a course for these kids. You'd probably think I was teaching 8-year-olds, but anyway, I wanted them to succeed. And after a few weeks, this little boy was running to class and he'd always be first in. Anyway, one day I was in the staff room and I said about this kid and somebody else said, well, of course, you probably give him detentions for being late. Well, yes, if I had kids who were persistently late, I would. I was a disciplinarian and I make no bones about that. One of the other teachers who was also teaching him said, oh no, he is getting success in her class and that is why he is running. That's what teaching's about.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow. What a life.